Would love for you all to reflect just in your chat box around this question. What does it feel like to be welcomed?
Happy, relaxed, comfortable, happy and secure, safe, celebrated for your identity, included, seen, worthy, accepted. Being welcome can minimize anxiety, being wanted and listened to.
Great. Well, I think those hit on some really important themes that I'm going to continue to come back to in our conversation today. But what I want to really note right now is that this is a question that has nothing to do with being an immigrant or not being an immigrant, because we can all relate to the idea of what it feels like to be welcomed, because all of us have a deep need to belong. And at the same time, all of us are hardwired to other. And to help illustrate why that's relevant to the conversation about immigration, I want to tell you a story that starts with the woman you see on your screen here. Her name is Miss Lucy. About a decade ago, she was an adult ESL instructor. She also taught US Civics in a community in Tennessee called Shelbyville. And like a lot of other places in our country, Shelbyville had changed demographically. There were a lot of new immigrants and specifically refugees who were moving into town. And Miss Lucy was charged with the task of helping them learn English, which was something that was crucially important to help them navigate life in this new place. At some point, though, Miss Lucy realized, though, that that wasn't enough, that it wasn't just newcomers who were trying to navigate a completely new environment, but also the community as a whole, because it had changed and they were hearing new languages and they didn't know what that meant for them. And so if Miss Lucy wanted to create an environment where her students could really succeed, she needed to be part of creating an environment where they could also truly belong. And to help her students truly belong, she needed to make sure that everybody in this changing community felt like they belonged, felt like they were welcome. So Miss Lucy got together with some other leaders in the community as part of a project called Welcoming Tennessee. And they really did two things. They worked to try to change the messages that people were hearing about newcomers. And they helped to bring people together, immigrants and non-immigrants, over just very basic community things, potluck dinners, at Rotary Club meetings, to try to bridge some of the divides that were occurring in the community. And that really helped to shift a community from a place of, frankly, a lot of fear and misperceptions to one where more people felt like they were valued, were seen, were all of the good things that all of you put in your chat boxes. And Shelbyville is better for it. More people are participating, and it's a stronger place today. And if you want to hear the deeper story of what happened in Shelbyville, you can see the film that's on the right side of the screen called Welcome to Shelbyville. Now, there's really two lessons that come out of the story of Shelbyville, and a third that I'll get to in a little bit. And the first is that immigration is really about change. And probably a lot of you have heard this line, which is, don't talk about immigration, it's too political. How many of you have heard that at some point in your work lives or elsewhere? A lot of us hear that, but the fact is that when we don't talk about something publicly, that just creates the space for the things that people are observing in their private lives, the very obvious demographic changes that are happening in communities, the things that people are talking about all the time but not talking about publicly. That creates the space for our worst fears to surface. And guess what? When our worst fears surface, then it does become political. So we have to be really proactive and create a space for a conversation to happen in our communities, not just the policy conversation, although that's important too, but really the human conversation. What does it mean to belong in a changing community? And then the second lesson from Miss Lucy's story is that while there's a lot of negative headlines that we hear about immigration for good reason, there's also a lot of untold positive stories happening all over the country right now. There are literally thousands of Miss Lucys all over the country. Many of you on this call, I think, reflect that, who are really upstanders in a pretty challenging moment for our country, who are being positive role models in helping create a more welcoming American community. Today, I want to just offer some additional ideas for how to be upstanders and how to challenge your students and your communities to be upstanders too. And if you're on the call today, you probably understand already why that's important. Many of you are living in these communities that are changing and maybe going through some rough patches in that. Maybe you have immigrant students who are being bullied, who are experiencing hate crimes, who are being told by their neighbors or by politicians that they don't belong. Maybe you just want to untangle a really complex issue and are looking for some resources to help you do that. Or maybe you're just one of the many educators in this country who are working with the 1 in 4 American kids who are immigrants or the children of immigrants. This is just who we are now. And so all of us are here, I think, to help one another learn and move through this moment in a more positive way. And I'm really grateful for the Immigrant Learning Center's efforts to put this call together. There's a fantastic group of panelists. And regardless of what brought you to this call, I just want to deeply thank you from the bottom of my heart, because what you're doing in the classrooms and communities that you're working in is really a microcosm of pluralistic democracy working. And that's what our country needs to see right now. So I hope we can all support one another in coming out of this challenging time in a better place. So here's my modest aspiration for the next half hour or so as we talk about how to cultivate upstanders and welcomers in classroom and community. And my task today is not about trying to teach you everything about immigration, but really trying to share some practices that builds the muscle memory that we need to create communities that are able to move more productively through this time of demographic change and come out better on the other end. Because in a world that's on the move and in an era of migration, it will be the places that are able to really incorporate people, make everyone feel welcome and included, develop the global skills to succeed in this economy and in a globalized world that are going to be successful. So let's spend some time today talking about what a welcoming environment is and why that's important. I'm going to share some tools, some new, some a little bit older for educators, and then I hope all of us can be sharing ideas and strategies with one another along the way. So I'm wearing actually 2 organizational hats in this call, and the first one is as the executive director of an organization called Welcoming America. And our work at Welcoming America is about helping to create a country where everyone can truly thrive and belong, including immigrants and refugees. And we do that through a network of members who are in about 500 communities all over the country. And this map is probably already outdated because every day there are more and more people and places who are standing behind this value and wanting to take action in their communities in a couple of ways. And first, communities want to really be looking at ways, just as Miss Lucy did, to create a community of neighbors, to bring people together, to foster positive relationships. And there's about 1 million ways you can do that. I'll talk in just a little bit about a few of them. Many of the communities we work with are also looking to shift the narrative to show how people in changing communities share common values. This is a campaign poster from one of the communities we work with in Nebraska. The initiative is called Nebraska is Home. And then lastly, welcoming is not just a feel-good idea. It's really about the kinds of policies and practices that are put in place at every level in the community, from schools to the halls of government. And one of the things that we've done at Welcoming America is to codify that into what we call the Welcoming Standard and a program of certification for communities against that standard. So from our work with communities around the country, we've learned a lot about what people are doing and have some practices to share, and I'm going to be talking about those in just a little bit. But I want to zoom in this conversation really around 3 things that I think welcomers or upstanders in this moment can really do. And the first is about centering on stories. The second is about fostering belonging in classrooms and communities. And the last is about sparking civic action. So let's start with centering on stories. And let me start by saying a little bit about why I believe so much in the power of Upstanders. And that is, if you participated in the homework for this call, then you've met my family. If you participated in the homework, you might have seen the Statue of Liberty image. And the people standing in front of it are my grandfather with my mother as a baby in his arms, my grandmother and my great aunt. My grandmother, who you see on the right, was a Holocaust survivor, and she and my grandfather, both as Holocaust survivors, lost just about everyone they loved in the world and came to the US with my mother in 1949 as refugees. My grandmother relentlessly told her story, and late in life created a series of 36 fabric and needlepoint tapestries that tell both her story of survival and her experience of coming to the United States as a refugee. So the Statue of Liberty image is one of them. And I began today talking about belonging and about othering. And othering was, of course, the driving force in the persecution of the Jews and the Roma and LGBTQ people and many others during the Holocaust. And in that very dark moment, like many dark moments throughout our history and here in the US during the Civil Rights Movement and today, people took on many roles as bystanders, as upstanders, as victims, as perpetrators, sometimes holding more than one of those identities. And of course, all of those people were reflected in my grandmother's story. She was 12 when her village was occupied by the Nazis. She was 15 when she and her family were ordered to be deported out of their town to their certain deaths. And she went to her parents and said, "I refuse to go." And taking a younger sister with her, they set out on their way and ultimately survived by assuming fake identities as Polish Catholic girls. And my grandmother was taken in by an older man whose farm she helped to keep during the war, and that's how she survived. And it was really thanks to him as an upstander that she survived and that I'm here today talking to you. And I want to bring up this story here. This is a moment during the war. The gentleman on the left is this old man whom my grandmother called Jadek, who took her in, and she's there tending his garden when two Nazi soldiers trample into it and ultimately are scared off by the bees. So I want to pause here and ask you to do the same homework that many of you did with the Statue of Liberty image, and just reflect on for a moment on what you observe and how it makes you feel and what it makes you think further about. And I also want you to take a moment to think about who in this picture is a perpetrator and who is an upstander.
Sure. Sharon says, "I would be really scared." And Janice says, "What a great example. My grandfather was smuggled." The image makes me feel very intimidated. I don't feel safe and like I don't belong. Perpetrator equals standing on a garden, upstander, approaching man with outstretched hand. This looks like people just living their lives, Tamar says. Gracie says the word entitlement comes to mind. The entitlement of the soldiers and how that doesn't create a welcoming environment. Kristen says admiration for the old man reaching out to a helpless person. Brandon thinks it's just arbitrary. Remember to send your comments to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see them. Mary says makes her feel scared and invaded. Scary and uncertain, Janet says.
Great, thank you for that, Denzel. So I think in just thinking about this in a classroom and just thinking about the different roles that are played at this time in history and that are played now, one of the things that I observed for the first time, even in just preparing for this webinar, was the role of the bees, these tiny creatures who have such a strong and mighty force in this part of the story and in this image of driving the Nazi soldiers away. And it made me think of all of us in society today, how little we can feel and yet how powerful we can be at really difficult moments in history. So that was my own personal reflection. The reason I'm sharing this example with you today is because I believe, and I have observed, and I think research bears out, and you'll hear plenty of examples of this throughout today and tomorrow, that by hearing somebody's story and by sharing our own stories, we're able to both regain a sense of agency and also develop a sense of empathy, which I think are the two most important things that we need to move us to a better place when it comes to both the debate around immigration and who we are as a society today. And for those reasons, Art and Remembrance, which is a nonprofit organization developed around the story and art of my grandmother, and using that experience and that artwork to help others understand both this point in history and its relevance to today. We've created lesson plans using my grandmother's story and situating it in contemporary issues, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But I want to first just thank the Immigrant Learning Center and many of you on this call today who may have participated last year when Claire Tesh, who has been working for Art and Remembrance, piloted some of these lesson plans and actually used the feedback that you all shared to inform their development. So thank you for that. So we've created these lesson plans. They address core themes like English language arts, social justice and civic engagement, and hit on a number of different topics ranging from children escaping war and conflict and connecting stories like my grandmother's to those of more contemporary refugees, talking about things like upstanders, bystanders, and victims, and situating that again in how people can reflect those values today. I've shared a little bit with you just in going through that exercise of how you can begin to think about upstanders and bystanders and victims. But I want to share another focus area for the lessons plans, which is story cloths. One of the things that was powerful in my grandmother's own catharsis of sharing her story was the ability as a non-native English speaker and also somebody who had been, had a limited education, was to be able to use art as a way to express herself. And we found that it's a very powerful tool, especially where language may be limited for story sharing. So here's an example from a project with some women who went back and looked at their own immigration stories and shared them with their own children to be able to have this intergenerational conversation about their own experiences, fleeing equally terrible things and finding hope and resilience in America. And you'll see they said it was a painful time, but important to share these stories. This is another project we did using story and art, which was a workshop that was done in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with a number of partners, including the Santa Fe Community College, Nuestra Jornada, and Mujeres de Adelante Cooperative, and using my grandmother's story as a catalyst for people to share their own stories through art. And you can see here one example where the woman who created this said that after 3 years of coming to the US, she had become a preschool teacher. And one day she was told by one of her coworkers that she was stealing somebody else's job. And so this was really a way to counter that stereotype and to help people understand why it's so false and so demeaning. So I want to leave you here with some resources that you can find at this website, artandremembrance.org, for educators, if this is a tool that you want to use in your own classroom or community to help surface the stories of folks who live there, and use those stories as a tool for building understanding between people. This is one great resource for helping people connect over stories. You'll be hearing about many others. I just want to pause here and give a shout out to two other story sharing examples that I think are terrific. One is an organization called Narrative 4, and the other is an organization called Green Card Voices that has also developed curriculum for helping students share their stories.
And I would just mention that Narrative 4 participated in last year's online workshop. We had Dr. Dawn Duncan, so if you go to our website, we actually have recordings and links to Narrative 4, their work.
That's great to hear. Denzel always has his finger on the pulse, so that's terrific. So I next want to talk about how to do this work of fostering belonging in the broader school and community environment. And while centering stories is crucially important, it's just one example of the many ways that we can foster positive interactions between people in a way that fosters agency and empathy. And when we look at how to create an environment where everyone can belong and feel welcome, it really takes a community to foster a sense of community. And that may be stating the obvious, but I think it's important to think about all of the different places, particularly in a school environment, where it's important to be bridging divides and creating opportunities to build understanding, and also looking at the kinds of policies that need to be in place to reduce the barriers that people are facing, and particularly immigrant and refugee students are facing, to full participation in the social, civic, and economic fabric of communities. And just to take this into a school environment, some of the kinds of things that we've seen our members around the country do when it comes to, for example, looking at how to engage students together, is establishing mentoring programs that bring together both newer immigrant students and also students who have maybe been in the community for a longer time or were born there, and really looking at how to pair them to establish a mentoring relationship. So programs like the Welcoming Belmont program in Dayton, Ohio, focused on using peers to really build up the skill set of both immigrant and non-immigrant peers to understand and be able to work with one another and feel that sense of belonging and confidence. At a staff level, it's obviously crucially important to create a supportive environment where at every level of the school, the message is clear that people are welcomed, and that starts obviously with school leadership, but should translate through to teachers, to support staff. And some of the things that we've seen are investments in capacity building, so that there's a recognition that it may be less of an issue of reticence and more of an issue of just developing the skill set to work with students from different backgrounds. And I'm hoping that now the chat box is being filled, and if it's not yet, I encourage you to, with ideas from your own schools about how you're working with staff or students to establish a welcoming environment, so that we can bring those into the conversation. It's also important to make sure that schools can be a trusted hub for parents from diverse backgrounds. And one of the examples I love so much is from a school in Oakley, California, that focused on bringing parents together, not around the topic of immigration, but really around what it means to be a parent navigating school and helping your students succeed, and turn that into a moment for dialogue between parents. And the result of that was parents developing stronger relationships with one another, but also taking a fresh look at some of the policies in the school that were making it a barrier for them to be participating in their kids' education, like materials being sent home in languages other than English. so that they could be better participants. So really bringing together both the policies that are needed to participate and also the relationships and environment and culture to support that. A lot of this can get theoretical pretty quickly. So one of the things that Welcoming America has done is created a tool called Building Welcoming Schools. And really, this is a tool focused around activities that can be done in a classroom environment to support positive interaction and dialogue among immigrant, refugee, and US-born students. The activities are pretty adaptable. They focus at all age levels. And here are some examples of the kinds of things that are in the toolkit. And I'll give you an example of just one of them here, which is an exercise called Dreaming Together. And our partner All for All in Pittsburgh has been working with schools to address many of the barriers to full participation that we just talked about, but also to do this exercise that helps bring together students in pairs or in small groups to learn about one another and to share their own ideas about what a welcoming environment might look like. And the exercise involves basically creating a Venn diagram where people can express their individual selves and also where they find common ground. And here's an example of one of these. And you can see in this example that both of the students have immigrant backgrounds and have come together around the really important common bond of ice cream. And as I said, these are activities that are adaptable for different age groups. So these are some extensions for middle and high school students to bring in immigration photos and talk about what other immigrants might be experiencing, or to reflect on the concept of homesickness. I want to share some examples because I know some of you are working in K-12 settings and others of you may be working in adult ed settings, but I want to pause before I do that and ask Denzel if there are maybe some interesting examples of efforts that some of those on the call are doing to create more welcoming school environments.
Ms. Barber commented that they hosted a cultural fair representing over 30 different countries with performances by students from Central and South America, India, Bulgaria, even the Marshall Islands. They shared food and boards with information about their countries. This is also something that the Immigrant Learning Center does every year. We have an international day, and that the mayor actually comes and visits, and each classroom is a different country. Hannah said they did anonymous interviews with students and parents. We then show those interviews as an iMovie to the teachers in the district, and it helped to begin conversations and understanding in the schools. Some really wonderful examples. Trying to pair students with those of similar language backgrounds to enable assistance in learning languages, using programs that translate English. This is from Patricia, who teaches computer science in a computer lab. She's lucky to have access to those resources. Vanessa said the assistant principal of world languages and ENL is assigned to lead a cultural day where students can showcase where they're from with dance and food. At the end of the last semester, Elaine said that she taught about the right to remain silent and other reactions to ICE. Her students said it was one of the most important classes of the semester. She was very aware of her role as a white person empowering them, but they were so grateful. And she also put a link to the ACLU Know Your Rights lesson plans.
That's terrific. And all of those are fantastic examples. I want to just draw out two themes from those that I think are important. And Denzel, in your example, I love that you not only created that opportunity for connections within the school environment, but really invited, by inviting the mayor into that, really invited in the broader community into that conversation. And I think, you know, again, immigration can be such a polarizing issue, but it's so important to help educate our elected officials and to help them see where immigration is working. And I think that, you know, there's no better potential place for that than in our classrooms and in our schools. So I think that's just a fantastic example. And also the individual who shared the example of sharing Know Your Rights information. There's a great toolkit by United We Dream that may answer some questions that I saw on the chain about how to support students that may be living in fear of deportation. And one of the recommendations that they make there is to really talk to everybody in the class about how important it is to know your rights, so that that message is really directed at everyone, even while recognizing that some people, are more deeply and personally affected by the possibility of it.
And I just want to mention a couple more because we had some really good ones. One person, her district created a welcome guide for parents of immigrant and refugee students, including general information about the school, expectations of the school, of parents, how to support their children at home. And Chandra Diaz said, immigrant parents were invited to speak during staff development events, which I think was really an excellent choice.
That's fantastic. And when we think about where most of us form our opinions about things, for all the things that we read and all the facts that we take in, the most important things influencing our opinion, particularly on this issue of immigration, are the connections that we make with other people. And there was a fabulous bit of research that was done some years back by the German Marshall Fund, which looked at opinions about immigration, both in the United States and also in Europe. And they found, probably not all that surprisingly, that people who had somebody that they knew who was an immigrant, a friend who was an immigrant, saw immigration as an opportunity, and those who didn't know somebody who was an immigrant saw it as a threat. So any opportunity you can create to build those personal connections is just so powerful and so important. Which brings me to this next resource, which is directed at instructors in more adult settings, although I think a lot of these could translate well into any setting. These are available on Welcoming America's website, and you'll be getting, I think, a copy of this presentation later. But this is filled with examples of other ways that you can create these moments of connection between adult learners. The last area that I want to touch on briefly is the need for civic action. And again, I think a lot of us experience this issue of immigration as one that feels challenging to wade into. And yet all of the research shows how important it is for people who have, particularly people who have experienced trauma, to regain a sense of agency and to really accomplish that by being involved in activities that shape their world, shape the policies that affect them. So it's important not only to create the individual interpersonal connections that help people feel like they belong, but also create the broader environment, both in terms of policies and practices that ensure that people are going to be able to participate at their fullest. And that can be done in classrooms, that can be done in a school environment, that can be done in the community. And I want to just hone in on a couple of specifics here to spark some ideas. And again, welcome all of you to share ways that you may be doing this in your own classrooms. We heard a little bit earlier about the census, and I think, if there was one thing to focus on in the coming year, again, it would be census. Really can't stress enough how important this is. Not just as a economic issue for communities, because so much of what resources will be going to communities will be determined by the census, but really as a reflection of the voice of the community. And for many of our neighbors who may be feeling invisible right now, the census is a extremely important moment to be counted. And I know that there's a lot of creative energy going into how to support educators in particular, because of the fear that's been intentionally created around the census through the possibility of adding a citizenship question. It's not an accident, it's by design, and the design is an effort to try to exclude people from having their voices be counted and heard. So that makes it really important for all of you as trusted messengers to reinforce the idea that it's important for people to participate. and also to reduce what will probably be the largest barrier to participation beyond fear, which is just accessibility, given the transition to the need to use technology to complete the 2020 census. So I wanted to give you here two really excellent resources. The first from the National Coalition for Literacy around the 2020 census. They've been collecting resources very specifically geared toward this audience, so I recommend that. And also Census Counts, which is just chock full of great resources, both in terms of building resources and making the case for the census, and also resources around how to encourage participation. One of the things that we have done at Welcoming America for the last 6 years is an event called Welcoming Week. And you can go to welcomingweek.org to learn a little bit more about it. Really, it was an idea that came out of our membership to create a moment in the middle part of September, which also happens to coincide with usually Citizenship Day and Hispanic Heritage Month, and some other events that can be built off of, to reinforce this message that our communities want to be welcoming, to involve local political leaders in sharing that message, but more importantly, to create moments for people to work together on common projects and discover common ground, and really show our country, in contrast to many of the messages we're hearing now about immigration, that it's really a positive thing for communities, and there is a path forward, and it's benefiting all of us. So there are literally thousands of actions that community members can take during Welcoming Week, and we really open it up as a challenge and an opportunity for anyone to host an event that's in the spirit of this ideal of being welcoming. So we've had educators use Welcoming Week as a chance to try out some of the ideas from the toolkits I shared, or to create their own ideas. And we will post events on our website if you want to share them with us. We'll lift up great ideas from all over the country, and really our goal is to shine a light on you as Upstanders, trying to make your communities better, and use that message of collective action to show what our country really looks like. So I'm going to pause here and just say that we're Welcoming America is a resource to all of you, along with Art and Remembrance, to support your efforts to create more welcoming classrooms and more welcoming communities. And this is where you can find us. And maybe with the benefit of a few extra minutes, I can pass the mic back to Denzel and to either move us along, or happy to answer any questions.
There's people from all across the country in this webinar, and one of the things that they're concerned about is this idea of sharing stories for children or students or adults who have experienced trauma or forced migration. Like, how do they respond to these kinds of topics? Is stories really a successful means for teaching topics that for them might be painful or sensitive?
That's a terrific question, and I think there's probably not one right answer for that. I think it's, I mean, in the environments we've worked in, I think what has worked well is to have already addressed some basic needs around safety and belonging before going into the experience of sharing stories. So obviously, if somebody doesn't feel safe, they can't learn. And if somebody is in an environment where they don't feel a sense of trust or safety with whoever the facilitator is, it's not going to be the most productive environment for them to allow themselves to feel vulnerable enough to share their story. So having somebody who can really be a skilled facilitator in that, not necessarily, you know, somebody with 20 years of experience and expertise as a facilitator, but just somebody who's able to have that kind of trust and relationship with the group is really important. I think in a lot of schools, and I know we're going to be talking more about immigrant trauma later in this conversation, so maybe we can get more into that there. You know, relying on others who may be skilled mental health facilitators or professionals is really crucial, and you know, bringing them in to support the experience would be important. But I would love to hear maybe what Claire has to share about that, or what others here have experienced in your own work around creating safe environments for for young people in particular to share their stories.
Yeah, I'm sure that we have some examples. So if people can type that into the chat box and share it with us. Another question that probably a lot of our participants get a lot, which is they want to foster belonging in their classroom, but they need buy-in from school leadership, and that can sometimes be a big problem. Do you have any strategies for educating or involving something to convince school leadership? I mean, some teachers are lucky when they have a principal who, can go out into the community and attend cultural events and engage with parents, but not everyone is so lucky, right?
Not everyone is so lucky. And, I think it depends on there's a lot of reasons why there might be resistance to the idea of trying something new. And some of it may be, that there is just fear of talking about these issues. As I said earlier, it feels political. And I think part of the value of translating this into a non-political topic, like creating a welcoming environment, is that it takes some of the edge off of these conversations and makes them about belonging and things that are important for everyone in a school community. I also think, it's important for school leadership to understand, again, that a lot of the skills that are being developed in these conversations are really the kinds of skills that are needed to create globally minded kids and adults. And those are really important skills for our workforce, for our communities. So sometimes taking a strengths-based or an asset-based approach to how this is framed can be really valuable.